Something that's interested me recently is how right-wing political grifters and people who claim to be libertarians in the US and Canada point to India and say colonialism was good. Here are the usual claims peddled by the likes of right-wing media outlets like Fox News or any of the alt-right independent news media outlets as they like to be called. England gave India a constitution. She gave them language, rule of law. She gave them trains. And of course, the trains. Some of them even try to claim today that India was a barbarous, uncivilized land that needed the Europeans to swoop in and civilize the native population, to liberate them from their beastly religion, beastly customs, and so on and so forth. You know the story. A sentiment not too different from those held by Brits of the 1950s.
Well, I'd like to know why the British, they're not giving their independence to Kenya.
Well, this is a question, do you mean because of the British government is not giving independence?
That's right.
Well, first of all, the people in Kenya, the actual natives themselves who form a vast majority, aren't economically capable of being independent. They're not politically ready for independence.
When are they going to be ready if you're not going to give them the rights now?
But one can't just force the white settlers to hand their land over or give in their economic powers, because they have the vested interests in Kenya. If they were to leave Kenya, Kenya would no longer be economically viable.
Why don't they let the people live among them, together with them? Why don't they let them intermingle with them? Why do they put a separation between the white and the black?
Well, the government doesn't impose this separation. It's the blacks and the whites that impose it on themselves. This is not an official policy like apartheid imposed by the Colonial Office of Great Britain. It's just that the white people regard themselves as richer and having a different culture, and so they don't want to mix. They feel that if they did mix by intermarriage and social mixture, they would their own culture would be swamped by the numerical superiority of the colored people. Yes.
You mean to say the people in Kenya don't have a culture of their own?
Yes, that's the point. They have a culture of their own, and this culture should be kept independent. It shouldn't be westernized.
Well, then give them their independence.
When they're ready for it.
But they don't, you see, you give them their education and they are living separately. They don't know what the whites are, how the whites act, and they won't have the same opinion as the whites then when they go to that Congress.
What is the point of bringing the blacks and the whites together if their educational
standards
are so much different?
They will understand each other. They will understand each other. They
will
have the same opinions.
Not if the one group is very well educated and the other group is illiterate. One must bring the blacks up to the standard of the whites, not bring the whites down to the standard of the blacks.
Well, you can't bring the blacks to the standard of the whites by intermingling them. Why can't you? Do you mean that if the whites get in contact with the black people, that they will just go lower instead of bringing up the black people?
That was a discussion amongst some school children from 1954, hardly a decade after Indian independence. Although it was more civil than conversations like that these days, people who just don't know any better and some who just happen to be racists use the same white supremacist arguments to defend colonialism. Whether it be Tucker Carlson trying to paint India as somehow ungrateful after the death of the Queen, or Jordan Peterson's conversation with a known anti-Indian on his podcast to discuss the benefits of colonialism in India. A whitewashed conversation that read like everything that came before the British was evil and everything that came after the British brought Christianity into India was good. These pro-colonialism videos disseminate myopic views tailored to fit the tastes of our xenophobic uncles of today. According to them, we are to believe that thousands of years of development from the Indus Valley civilization around 3300 BCE, one of the oldest civilizations on par with that of Mesopotamia in Egypt, to the great Cholas who influenced much of Southeast Asia and ruled for 1500 years, did not somehow have rule of law, culture, civilization, or language? How do they hold that? Having once been a fan of Jordan Peterson during his self-help days, I came across his pro-colonialism videos at a time when he'd come back from his benzo addiction. He came back noticeably different, erratic, mean-spirited, and irrational. This was another video among many that revealed his true colors as a right-wing political grifter claiming to be a libertarian. Before European colonialism of the Portuguese, Dutch, French and English began to take hold in parts of India, India had 32% of the world's GDP. And after hundreds of years of looting, enslavement, manufactured famines, and attempts at wiping out Indian culture, the leech of colonialism sapped India's GDP down to less than 3%. Here, your modern day racists from North America will use the same logic they've been using against the black community and indigenous populations to defend this. Unfortunately, there are people in real life who say this about First Nations people in Canada. If it weren't for us Europeans, they'd still be living in tents. Do you want to live in a tent? To which I say, have you heard of the Haida? Oh, you know, the 6,000-year-old First Nations people of Canada who had permanent houses on the coasts of BC, made of wood, like your cabin, just with a giant greeting totem. And on colonialism around the world, they'd say, well, it's their culture. If it wasn't for the civilizing efforts of Western Europeans, they mean white men when I say this, they'd still be living in squalor and poverty anyway. They needed us to help them. Sure, help relieve their pockets of their coin. You see, this argument is like if a burglar were to break into your own home, kill you, enslave your wife and children, and re-educate them using ideas as to why it's good to be robbed. But wait, there's a twist, because the burglar is a surprisingly good cook. Because of that, you were able to absorb his cooking knowledge while you were hanging upside down from the rafters, ready to be flogged. Surely the burglary must have been good for your children, because hey, at least now they can make some decent scrambled eggs. You might think, hey, that's a really silly thing for me to say. And yeah, I agree. So let's talk about some facts. Let's start with the big one, the sexy one, trains. As Dr. Shashi Taroor put it, India missed the bus on industrialization because the British threw us under it. The trains were not built for the benefit of Indians. British engineers didn't plan it out by saying, let's give Indians some trains. No, Indians were not even allowed on the trains in the beginning. They were staffed entirely by white British. And the main purpose of the trains was to more efficiently loot the land. The best part for the British was that it was all paid for by Indian taxpayer money. This money was money that was not used to further improve the lives of Indians. I mentioned this historical fact to a family friend once, who was a Canadian conservative. We weren't debating anything. We weren't even having any kind of heated discussion. And his knee-jerk reaction was, well, that's just smart. I didn't bother explaining to him why it was smart only for the white British and not for the exploited Indians. Let's not forget that before the hyper-capitalist East India Company was established in the 1600s, England accounted for about 2% of the world's GDP. At a time when a declining Mughal Empire accounted for 24% of the world's GDP. And this is not even counting any of the trillions of dollars worth in riches still tucked away in temples today. Like the Padmanabhaswamy temple in Kerala, which houses about $1 trillion. But by the 1900s, this was flipped. Interesting how that works. Now, I'm not even a fan of Turkic Mughal imperialism, but at least they kept the loot in the country and didn't have a colonial web that stretched back to Persia, a culture which they loved and simped for all the time, even making Persian one of the most widely spoken languages during the Mughal Empire. But that's a story for another day. Now let's talk about the Indian textile industry and that of spices and incense, of which Romans and Greeks were some of the largest consumers. Through the Red Sea route, the Romans like to call India's finest silks woven winds on account of their airy lightness. Trade with India alone also pumped about 1 billion sesterces worth of taxable eastern goods into the Roman territories. The revenue generated from these taxes contributed to the cost of maintaining the professional Roman army, which helped sustain the Pax Romana. 200 years of peace and prosperity in Europe. We even have records of economic discussions taking place at court among Roman ministers complaining that their wives were buying too much Indian silk and saris. Blue dye was so closely linked to India that the ancient Greeks got its western name indigo, from the country itself. For those unaware, the origins of this are derived from Sanskrit, the Sanskrit word Sindhu, like the Saraswati Sindhu river. However, in Parsi, the sound for S turns to H, making it Hindu, but the Greeks prefer to say Indu, and that's how we get Indus, which is now India. Oversimplified a little bit, but now you know. Knowing this rich storied history of craftsmanship and trade, what did the British do? As John Sullivan, the founder of the British settlement of Uttakamund, known as Ooty, said in 1840, "The Englishman flourishes and acts like a sponge, drawing up riches from the banks of the Ganges and squeezing them down the banks of the Thames." They made a point to terrorize looms and silk farms to monopolize the market. The East India Company enforced this monopoly with an iron hand. Bolts, in 1772, an English merchant and former employee of the East India Company, said that weavers who refused to sell to the British or agree to their exploitative pricing strategies were frequently seized, imprisoned, fined considerable sums of money, and flogged. He also mentioned how winders of raw silks protested and escaped being forced to wind silks for the British by cutting off their thumbs. And if violence and intimidation wasn't enough, the British had other means back home to ensure that the oppression was thorough. Nakatomi in 1993 writes that British manufacturers were levied an 85% tax for importing Indian-made hand-woven calico and 44% for British Raj muslin. So the British weren't successful because they were somehow inherently better at business. They just didn't have any moral qualms about terrorizing and bullying native populations because they were just in the way. The Seleucid Empire, a major center of Hellenistic culture, even acquired elephants from the Mauryans as part of peace deals and remained an important fixture in their armies until their defeat at the hands of the Romans in 190 BC. Now, I can go on and on about this, and the historical information we have on this is plentiful and easily accessible, but still these right-wing grifters choose to peddle the narrative that our ancestors were devoid of culture until European colonial powers arrived on our shores, pretending to be friendly merchants even though our ancestors directly traded with theirs. No conquering required so many years ago. Now let's talk about a little known legacy that the British Protestant missionaries left behind and its impact on caste. I must note that Christianity reached India in about AD 52, hundreds of years before Europe. In Kerala, we still have Syriac Christian communities who have Aramaic infused into their Malayalam dialect. So please know that this is not some kind of knock on Christianity. This section will just touch on the British Protestant movements of the 1800s and their direct impact on India. British Protestants had a particular disdain for India and its various indigenous cultures and religions. Anyway, Herbert Hope Risley. This is the name that we must remember. He was a Protestant missionary scientist responsible for studying the jatis or tribes of India and caste so that the British could better govern the Indians. The problem was India had thousands of jatis with their own traditions and cultures, gods and dialects. So how would you categorize all of them into a small set of castes? Well, as part of their scientific research, Herbert's team measured the craniums and nasal index of the Indian people and allegedly discovered a relationship between proportions of Aryan blood and the nasal index, along with a gradient of higher caste to the lowest. Another problem for them arose when the jatis they were interviewing and studying did not even know what castes they were talking about. So Herbert's team just slotted them into a sliding scale of caste, just depending on their features or perceptions of how much Aryan blood they may have had. The assumption was that the more European a tribe looked, the higher the caste. The more African a tribe looked, the lower the caste. Their sample size was 100 people, of which apparently they only studied about 30 people. Yet Herbert was lauded as a great scientist at his time and died of an unknown illness when he got back to India in 1911. However, for the Indians, the damage lives on. Also, Indian Christians have never been Christian enough for some European Christians. The Portuguese Catholics called for an inquisition in Goa in 1536. This inquisition carried on until 1821. That is a long time. The primary reasons for this was that Saint Francis Xavier did not like the fact that Portuguese settlers were actually assimilating well into Goan society. They were intermarrying and taking on Goan traditions, which were seen as evil and backwards. During this inquisition, temples were destroyed, Hindus, Muslims and Jews were persecuted and made to pay heavy taxes unless they converted. However, even after these people converted, they realized that they could never wipe the brown from their skins, so the persecution continued. All this info might be distressing to some, and some might even think it's unnecessary, but I need to write this and I need to speak this because I keep seeing a lot of right-wingers claim that colonialism and hyper-capitalism were good over and over again. And there's more, like the Criminal Tribes Act that the British imposed, which deemed certain problematic tribes as criminal from birth. These tribes still deal with the consequences of this to this day, as the systemic divide caused by these laws created a rift between them and other Indian communities. So thank you for rule of law. And this part of Indian history is something that comes to my mind whenever I see how American media portrays African Americans and indigenous people in the US and Canada. And lastly, the British didn't just get up and leave. They were purged. The sun never set on the British Empire because even God couldn't trust the British in the dark. So I know this is like a new weird setup. This is like temporary, but you know what? I kind of like it. I think it's kind of nice. Thank you for watching. I've got a lot more videos coming up and I've started writing on Medium as well. So if you want to check out my articles, please go ahead and follow me on there. I look forward to seeing you guys next time.